Hey everyone, the name is Eric Thorne. In today's video we're talking about autism and being on the spectrum and struggling with sensory processing sensitivity. And now most autistic people, if not all of them, seem to struggle with issues related to sensory processing sensitivity, which means that you have a stronger, on average, response to sensory stimuli than normal, and that you struggle with processing and managing and dealing with sensory stimuli, right? And that's any kind of sensory stimuli, from sight, touch, smell, or different forms of sounds or things like that, right? And here, a lot of the time, these kinds of issues can come up and manifest in a wide variety of ways. The truth is, one of the most interesting things about being on the spectrum is somehow correlated with IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, and various forms of tummy problems and things like that, right? So this is something that's very interesting, right? Why are people on the spectrum more sensitive to this? Why is this such a problem? And why do so many people on the spectrum struggle with a sense of overwhelm or irritation or frustration with sensory sounds, with smells and things that don't feel nice, like the texture and the fabric of your clothes or the tag behind your back, right? Like, why are these things so difficult and so overwhelming for highly sensitive people? Well, the truth is, I think we've been thinking about this all wrong. It's not that sensory processing sensitivity or tummy problems are a must-have or a norm for these types. And it's not the case that when you are on the spectrum that you're just gonna deal with these things for the rest of your life and you're never gonna ever be able to manage or figure out where these things come from. And a lot of the time, what I think is going on is, and this is my personal opinion, it's not that these sensory symptoms are a norm for the diagnosis itself, it's that they are a result of things like masking, like things like overwhelm, like things like exhaustion, like things that being on the edge, right? Because what I found is that sensory processing sensitivity seems to manifest the most when people are in overwhelming situations, when they are exhausted, when they've spent a lot of time masking or trying to fit in, and basically they're starting to get overwhelmed, right? And suddenly things become really unbearable, like your partner's loud chewing or noises in your environment or bright lights and things like that suddenly become this way of your body telling you, you need to slow down. You're getting overwhelmed, you're getting overworked, you're getting tired. And now these issues are starting to come about. And here, this is often what we're finding is things like IBS seem to be treatable not just through various forms of medication, but actually from lifestyle changes and from ways to help people reduce stress and different forms of psychological treatments. And so it seems that a lot of these issues could be managed if we were able to help people on the spectrum to unwind, to reduce stress, and to get more control on their environment, right? And it makes sense that you have these feelings because a lot of the time, people on the spectrum seem to struggle with taking in new information, right? And when you take in new information, it can be difficult to categorize and map this data. It can be contradicting your previous experience. It can be something that doesn't fit with anything you've done before. It can be a place of uncertainty or something that can be scary or difficult to manage in different ways. And this can lead to, of course, either a tendency to avoid these situations or a tendency to go into these situations, but to, after being in these situations, get overwhelmed because you went into these situations, because they were taxing. Even if you had fun and enjoyed doing them, they were still taxing, right? So what seems to be the case is that typically when you're on the spectrum, and of course it can vary depending on your position in this spectrum, people with autism seem to be better at managing and organizing information and structuring things, but worse when it comes to taking in new information, because perhaps they built this really good system that works for them personally, but as soon as they go outside of that system, they're uncomfortable because they're on foreign grounds, they're in a situation that's difficult. They don't know the people, they don't understand the social signals, they don't know what people are going to say or do or what they're gonna mean or what's gonna happen next. And without a schedule, without a plan, without these kinds of environments and without these kinds of structures, it can be slightly taxing. And if you are especially inclined towards organizational structure, a lot of the time this organizational structure can be like a comfort blanket that helps you unwind. And knowing that you can go back to these systems whenever you want to is often very comforting for people on the spectrum. If you are able to build a good and solid structure, which you can always go back to whenever you start feeling overwhelmed, and if you can learn to take effective breaks and time for yourself, and if you're able to create a workplace or environment around yourself where stimuli is kept to a minimum, well, of course, your battery is going to go down less and you're less likely to get these kinds of sensitive reactions or overreactions, as some might see them, in different situations. So when you start to feel like it's getting way too much, like it can be that you can become, or you can start to overreact and you can start to have these kinds of emotional reactions. And now it's important to remember that most emotions are triggered by physical sensations. A lot of the time, emotions are stored in our body, in our smells, in our experiences, and things that have happened to us in the past, in different ways. And so when we go to a certain situation, it can be that you smell something that reminds you of a previous situation that you didn't like, and that can trigger a bad memory, and that can trigger a bad feeling, and so on and so forth, right? So a lot of the time, the emotions and the heightened emotional sensitivity that you can also see in regards to this is probably directly proportional to the sensory overstimulation, right? Because when your sensory is overstimulated, you're more likely to have these kinds of emotional overreactions, because sensory experiences seem to directly trigger emotional experiences, right? And this goes even further if you have an overactive mind or imagination, and you can start interpreting all these signals and you start drawing conclusions based on the patterns that you've observed or things that have happened, or basically comparing past experiences to new situations to see, oh yeah, this is kind of similar, and then ending up like getting really anxious because of that, right? It's ultimately very complicated. It's hard to say what it is that we need to do in order to make sure that we don't have these overreactions, but it's also important to recognize that overreactions are a sign of having been underreacting for a very long time. And often the more we repress different experiences and distance ourselves from something or detach ourselves from something, the more we're going to have to pay the price later. I remember reading a science fiction once about a world where you had been able to effectively shut off emotionality in human beings, right? So basically, whenever people were starting to get emotional, what would happen is different neurotransmitters would be released into the brain that would help reduce this overwhelm and help the person become more calm. However, these humans ended up with an emotional tax, which means that, they had to basically turn those things off later on in order to effectively manage those emotions, because those emotions would not go away. Like the neurotransmitters were able to basically shut down the signals that were able to cause the person to feel those things, but they didn't make it go away. And here, like, the general mantra seems to be true. We can't repress, we can't shut down emotions, we can't ignore the fact that we're having a sensory experience or that we are reacting to something or feeling something in the situation. And if we prevent ourselves from feeling something, and here, for example, masking comes to mind, if we pretend that we're happy and calm and confident and that everything's great, obviously that feeling is still going to be there, and it's going to be there until you're able to recognize that it's there and take the time to feel it and take the time to address and identify a strategy for how you want to manage it. Which puts us in the shitter, because a lot of the time it would be that you'd want to just shut it off, and you'd want to just not feel it, and you'd want to just not deal with it, because you want to fit in, right? You want to, for example, be able to stay and look confident and calm at your workplace. You want to be and act cool in social situations and environments. You want to be able to fit in. You don't want to say or do anything weird or abnormal. But often what I see is autistic people and people on the spectrum that are more open about sensitivity and the fact that they're feeling nervous, or the fact that they need a break, or that they're starting to get a bit overwhelmed, or that it's loud or it's difficult. People that are able to talk about and admit to that feeling seem to fare better in terms of energy management. They seem to be able to better modulate their responses and to calm down, and they seem to better effectively manage their own emotions. They seem to be better when it comes to identifying the right strategy for how to deal with it. They might get help from friends and people around them to support them, to make sure that it's easier for them, and so on. So it seems that when we're able to unmask and to be able to admit to, oh, I'm kind of a bit nervous right now, or a bit rattled, or I'm kind of nervous, I don't know what to expect here, I don't know what's going on, or what's going to be planned, or what's going to happen next. And so people that can say that seem to, in general, fare better when it comes to SPS and HSP. And I'm not saying here that this is going to cause HPS or HSP to disappear. And I'm not saying here that SPS is only a bad thing. A lot of people also say that it allows you to have more intense positive experiences, right? Which means that a lot of time, an experience can feel ultimately so really nice, you know, when we're very comfortable, when we're in a very tranquil state, when we're like in a really nice environment or something is there, like it can be so nice that, you know, you can start to cry or tear up, or that it can be like, oh my gosh, like this is so nice. Like it can be just this feeling of super happiness, right? So it's not just that SPS or HSP is a bad thing. It's the problem is when we become overwhelmed, it starts to very easily slip into being a bad thing, right? Which is like when you're on a roller coaster and you want to get off, and it becomes like, oh, I can't get off. You're like in the situations like, basically the point that I'm trying to say is, it's not that you're overreacting. It's not that the tea was too strong, or that the person was chewing too loudly. That in itself was not the problem. The problem was you were understimulated, you were tired, and you wanted a break. And now you were starting to have sensory reactions to these situations because you needed a break. And because your body and your mind was trying to find reasons to get you to take a break. And yeah, that's the annoying conflict between sensory and emotional intelligence, and yeah, that's how you can better manage SPS as a person with autism, or a person on the spectrum, or just a highly sensitive person in general.